Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Kallipolis Radio. Today, I'll be reading more of Arthur Schopenhauer's collected Aphorisms. This section is titled, On Religion. Thanks for listening. Faith and knowledge. Philosophy, as a science, has nothing whatever to do with what should or may be believed. It has only to do with what can be known. If this should turn out to be something quite other than what one is supposed to believe, that is no disadvantage even for the belief, since it is the nature of belief to teach what cannot be known. If it could be known, belief would be ludicrous and useless. It would be, for instance, as if one should propound a theory to be held by faith in the field of mathematics. It can, on the other hand, be objected that faith can teach more, much more, than philosophy. Yet it can teach nothing which could be combined with the conclusion of philosophy, because knowledge is of a harder stuff than faith, so that when they collide, the latter is shattered. In any event, faith and knowledge are totally different things, which, for their mutual benefit, have to be kept strictly separate, so that each goes its own way without paying the slightest attention to the other. Revelation. The ephemeral generations of man are born and pass away in quick succession. Individual men, burdened with fear, want, and sorrow, dance into the arms of death. As they do so, they never weary of asking what it is that ails them, and what the whole tragicomedy is supposed to mean. They call on heaven for an answer, but heaven stays silent. Instead of a voice from heaven, there come along priests with revelations. But he is still in his childhood who can think that superhuman beings have ever given our race information about the aim of its existence or that of the world. There are no other revelations than the thoughts of the wise, even if these, subject to error, as are all things human, are often clothed in strange allegories and myths and are then called religions. To this extent, therefore, it is all one whether you live and die trusting in your own thoughts or in those of others, for you are never trusting in anything but human thoughts and human opinion. Yet, as a rule, men have a weakness for putting their trust in those to pretend to supernatural sources of knowledge, rather than in their own heads. But if you bear in mind the enormous intellectual inequality between man and man, then the thoughts of one may very well count with another as revelation. The fundamental, secret, and primal piece of astuteness of all priests, everywhere and at all times, whether Brahmin or Mohammedan or Buddhist or Christian, is as follows. They have recognized and grasped the enormous strength and the ineradicability of the metaphysical need of man. They then pretend to possess the means of satisfying it, in that the solution to the great enigma has, by extraordinary channels, been directly communicated to them. Once they have persuaded men of the truth of this, they can lead and dominate them to their heart's content. The more prudent rulers enter into an alliance with them. The others are themselves ruled by them. If, however, as the rarest of all exceptions, a philosopher comes to the throne, the whole comedy is disrupted in the most unseemly fashion. On Christianity. To arrive at a just judgment of Christianity, one must first consider what preceded it and what it supplanted. First and foremost, Greco-Roman paganism, considered as popular metaphysics a very trivial affair, without any real distinct dogmas, without any categorical ethic, indeed without any real moral tendency, and without sacred scriptures, so that it hardly deserves to be called a religion at all. It is rather a play of fantasy, a production cobbled together by poets out of popular legends, and for the most part an obvious personification of natural forces. It is hard to imagine that grown men ever took this childish religion seriously, yet there are many passages in ancient writers which suggest that they did, notably the first book of Valerius Maximus, but even a good many passages in Herodotus. In later times, and with the advance of philosophy, such serious credence vanished, which made it possible for Christianity to supplant this state religion, in spite of its external supports. The second thing that Christianity had to supplant was Judaism, whose rude dogma was sublimated and tacitly allegorized in the Christian. Christianity is in general definitely of an allegorical nature, for what in profane matters is called allegory is in religions called mystery. It has to be conceded that Christianity is much superior to both of these earlier religions, not only as regards morality, in which it alone, so far as the Occident is concerned, teaches caritas, reconciliation, love of one's enemy, resignation and denial of one's own will, but even as regards dogma. It is best, however, to communicate this to the great masses, who are incapable of grasping truth directly, in the form of a beautiful allegory, which completely suffices them as a guide to practical living and as an anchor of consolation and hope. But a small addition of absurdity is a necessary ingredient in such an allegory. It serves to indicate its allegorical nature. If you take Christian dogma sensu proprio, then Voltaire is right. Taken allegorically, on the other hand, it is a sacred myth, a vehicle for bringing to the people truths which would otherwise be altogether inaccessible to them. Even the Church's assertion that reason is totally incompetent and blind with respect to the dogmas of religion, and must be repudiated, means at bottom that these dogmas are of an allegorical nature, and therefore not to be judged by the standards which reason, which takes everything sensu proprio, can alone apply. The absurdities of dogma are precisely the mark and sign of the allegorical and mythical, even though, in the present case, they arise from the need to link together two such heterogeneous doctrines as those of the Old and the New Testaments. This great allegory first came about gradually through the interpretation of external and chance circumstances, under the silent influence of a deep-lying truth, not clearly present in the consciousness, until it was finally completed by Augustine, who penetrated most deeply into its meaning, and was able to comprehend it as a systematic whole, and to supply what was lacking in it. Thus the complete and perfect Christian doctrine is that of Augustine, as also affirmed by Luther, and not, as present-day Protestants who, taking revelation sensu proprio, confine it to one individual. Think primitive Christianity, just as it is not the seed but the fruit which is edible. Yet the weak point of all religions remains that they can never dare to confess to being allegorical, so that they have to present their doctrines in all seriousness as true sensu proprio, which, because of the absurdities essential to allegory, leads to perpetual deception and a great disadvantage for religion. What is even worse, indeed, is that in time it comes to light that they are not true sensu proprio, and then they perish. To this extent, it would be better to admit their allegorical nature straight away. Only the difficulty here is to make the people understand that a thing can be true and not true at the same time. But since we find that all religions are constituted to a greater or lesser degree in this way, we have to recognize that the absurd is to a certain extent appropriate to the human race, indeed an element of its life, and that deception is indispensable to it, a fact which is confirmed in other directions. Evidence for, and an example of the above-mentioned origin of absurdities in the union of the Old Testament and the New, is provided by, among other things, the Christian doctrine of predestination and grace, perfected by Luther's guiding star, Augustine. According to this doctrine, one man has the advantage over another of being the object of divine grace, which amounts to coming into the world possessed of a ready-made privilege, and one in respect of the most important matter of all. The offensiveness and absurdity of this doctrine originates, however, entirely in the presupposition, derived from the Old Testament, that man is the work of an external will, which called him up out of nothing. But, considering that genuine moral superiority actually is inborn, the matter appears in a quite different and more rational light under the Brahmanic and Buddhist presupposition of metempsychosis, according to which whatever advantages a man may be born with, he has brought with him from another world and an earlier life, so that they are not a gift of grace, but the fruit of his own deeds performed in the other world. To this dogma of Augustine there is, however, joined this worse one, that out of the mass of mankind, who are corrupt and thus doomed to everlasting damnation, a very small number are, as a consequence of predestination and election by grace, acquitted and will consequently be saved, while deserved destruction and the eternal torments of hell will be visited on the rest. Taken sensu proprio, the dogma here becomes revolting, for not only does it punish the faults, or even the mere lack of faith, of a life hardly more than 20 years long, with torments which have no end, it also adds that this almost universal damnation is actually the effect of original sin, and thus the necessary consequence of man's first fall. But this must have been foreseen by, at any rate, him who firstly failed to make men better than they are, and then set a trap for them into which he must have known that they would fall, since everything was his work and nothing was hidden from him. According to this dogma, then, he called into existence out of nothing a weak and sin-prone race in order to hand it over to endless torment. There is finally the further fact that the God who prescribes forbearance and forgiveness of every sin, even to the point of loving one's enemy, fails to practice it himself, but does rather the opposite, since a punishment which is introduced at the end of things, when all is over and done with forever, can be intended neither to improve nor to deter. It is nothing but revenge. Thus regarded, it seems that the entire race is in fact definitely intended and expressly created for eternal torment and damnation. All, that is, apart from those few exceptions which are rescued from this fate by divine grace, although one knows not why. These aside, it appears as if the dear Lord created the world for the benefit of the devil, in which event he would have done far better not to have created it at all. This is what happens to dogmas when you take them sensu proprio. Understood sensu allegorico, on the other hand, all this is susceptible of a more satisfactory interpretation. What is absurd, indeed revolting in this doctrine is, however, as has already been said, first and foremost merely a consequence of Judaic theism, with its creation from nothing and that which goes with it, the really paradoxical and scandalous denial of the natural doctrine of metempsychosis, a doctrine which is, to a certain extent, self-evident, and which has therefore been in all ages accepted by virtually the entire human race, with the exception of the Jews. It was precisely to obviate the colossal disadvantage arising from this rejection of metempsychosis, and to moderate the revolting nature of the dogma, that in the 6th century, Pope Gregory I very wisely developed the doctrine of purgatory, which is, in its essentials, to be found as early as Origen, and formally incorporated it into the teaching of the Church, whereby a kind of substitute for metempsychosis was introduced into Christianity, inasmuch as both constitute a process of purification. It was with the same objective in view that the doctrine of the restoration of all things was instituted, according to which even the sinners are one and all restituted in integrum in the last act of the universal comedy. Only the Protestants, with their obstinate Bible religion, have refused to let themselves be deprived of everlasting punishment in hell. Much good may it do 'em, one might say maliciously. The consolation is, however, that they do not really believe in it. For the moment they are leaving that subject alone, thinking in their hearts, "Oh, it won't be as bad as all that." The Augustinian conception of the enormous number of these sinners, and the very small number of those who deserve eternal bliss, which is in itself a correct conception, is also to be discovered in Brahmanism and Buddhism, where, however, the doctrine of metempsychosis robs it of its repellent character. It is true that in the former final redemption, and in the latter nirvana, is also granted to very few. But these do not come into the world specially chosen and privileged. Their deserts are those they have acquired in a previous life, and which they continue to maintain in the present one. The rest, however, are not cast into the pit of hell. They are transported to the kind of world which is in keeping with their deeds. If, consequently, you should ask the propounders of these religions where and what all those who have not attained to redemption are, they would reply, "Look around you. Here is where they are. This is what they are. This is their arena. This is samsara, i.e. the world of desire, of birth, of pain, of age, of sickness, and of death." On the other hand, if this Augustinian dogma of the tiny number of the elect and the great number of the eternally damned is understood merely sensu allegorico, and interpreted in the sense of our own philosophy, then it agrees with the fact that only very few achieve denial of the will, and thereby redemption from this world, as in Buddhism only very few achieve nirvana. What, on the other hand, this dogma hypostatizes as eternal damnation is nothing other than this world of ours. This is what devolves upon all the rest. It is a sufficiently evil place. It is purgatory. It is hell, and devils are not lacking in it. Only consider what men sometimes inflict upon men, with what ingenious torments one will slowly torture another to death, and ask yourself whether devils could do more. And sojourn in this place is likewise eternal for all those who obdurately persist in affirming the will to live. But in truth, if one from Asia should ask me what Europe is, I would have to reply, it is the continent utterly possessed by the unheard of and incredible delusion that the birth of man is his absolute beginning, and that he is created out of nothing. Fundamentally, and both their mythologies apart, Buddha's samsara and nirvana are identical with Augustine's two civitates into which the world is divided, the civitas terrena and coelestis. The devil in Christianity is a very necessary personage, as a counterweight to the all-goodness, omniscience, and omnipotence of God. It is impossible to see where the predominating, incalculable, and boundless evil of the world is supposed to come from, if the devil is not there to assume responsibility for it. Since the rationalists have abolished him, the disadvantage to the other side accruing from his absence has grown greater and more evident, which could have been foreseen and was foreseen by the orthodox. For you cannot remove one pillar from a building without endangering the rest. This also confirms what has been established elsewhere, that Jehovah is a transformation of Ormuzd, and Satan of Ahriman, who is inseparable from him. Ormuzd himself, however, is a transformation of Indra. Christianity possesses the peculiar disadvantage that, unlike the other religions, it is not a pure doctrine, but essentially and above all a history, a succession of events, a complex of facts, and the actions and sufferings of individuals, and it is this history which constitutes the dogma belief, in which redeems. Another fundamental error of Christianity is that it has, in an unnatural fashion, sundered mankind from the animal world to which it essentially belongs, and now considers mankind alone as of any account, regarding the animals as no more than things. This error is a consequence of creation out of nothing, after which the Creator, in the first and second chapters of Genesis, takes all of the animals just as if they were things, and without so much as the recommendation to kind treatment, which even a dog seller usually adds when he parts with his dogs, hands them over to a man for man to rule, that is, to do with them what he likes. Subsequently, in the second chapter, the Creator goes on to appoint him the first professor of zoology, by commissioning him to give the animals the names they shall henceforth bear, which is once more only a symbol of their total dependence on him, i.e., their total lack of rights. It can truly be said, men are the devils of the earth, and the animals are the tormented souls. This is the consequence of that installation scene in the Garden of Eden, for the mob can be controlled only by force or by religion, and here Christianity leaves us shamefully in the lurch. I heard from a reliable source that a Protestant pastor, requested by an animal protection society to preach a sermon against cruelty to animals, replied that with the best will in the world he was unable to do so, because he could find no support in his religion. The man was honest, and he was right. When I was studying at Göttingen, Blumenbach spoke to us very seriously about the horrors of vivisection, and told us what a cruel and terrible thing it was, wherefore it should be resorted to only very seldom, and for very important experiments which would bring immediate benefit, and even then it must be carried out as publicly as possible, so that the cruel sacrifice on the altar of science should be of the maximum possible usefulness. Nowadays, on the contrary, every little medicine man thinks he has the right to torment animals in the cruelest fashion in his torture chamber, so as to decide problems whose answers have for long stood written in books into which he is too lazy and ignorant to stick his nose. Special mention should be made of an abomination committed by Baron Ernst von Bibra at Nuremberg with incomprehensible naivete, tanquam re bene gesta, narrated by him to the public in his Vergleichende Untersuchungen über das Gehirn des Menschen und der Wirbeltiere. He deliberately let 2 rabbits starve to death, in order to undertake the totally idle and useless experiment of seeing whether starvation produces a proportional change in the chemical composition of the brain. For the ends of science, n'est-ce pas? Have these gentlemen of scalpel and crucible no notion at all, then, that they are first and foremost men, and chemists only secondly? How can you sleep soundly, knowing you have harmless animals under lock and key in order to starve them slowly to death? Don't you wake up screaming in the night? It is obviously high time that the Jewish conception of nature, at any rate in regard to animals, should come to an end in Europe, and that the eternal being which, as it lives in us, also lives in every animal, should be recognized as such, and as such treated with care and consideration. One must be blind, deaf, and dumb, or completely chloroformed by the fetter Judaicus, to not see that the animal is in essence absolutely the same thing that we are, and that the difference lies merely in the accident, the intellect, and not in the substance, which is the will. The greatest benefit being conferred by the railways is that they spare millions of draft horses their miserable existence. On theism. Just as polytheism is the personification of individual departments and forces of nature, so monotheism is the personification of the whole of nature at one blow. But when I try to imagine myself standing before an individual being and saying to him, "My Creator, once I was nothing, but you have brought me forth, so that now I am something, and what that something is myself," and then adding, "Thank you for this favor," and even concluding with, "If I have been good for nothing, that is my fault," then I must confess that, as a consequence of my philosophical and Indian studies, my head has become incapable of sustaining such a thought, and this thought is moreover a counterpart of that which Kant presents us in the Critique of Pure Reason, in the section on the impossibility of a cosmological proof. One cannot resist the thought, although neither can one endure it, that a being which we imagine as the highest of all possible beings says, as it were, to himself, "I am from eternity to eternity. There is nothing beside me except what exists purely through my will. But whence am I, then?" It is all one whether you make an idol of wood, stone, metal, or put it together out of abstract concepts. As soon as you have before you a personal being to whom you sacrifice, on whom you call, whom you thank, it is idolatry. It also makes little difference at bottom whether you sacrifice your sheep or your inclinations. Every rite, every prayer is an incontrovertible witness to idolatry. That is why mystical sects of all religions agree in doing away with all rites. Old and New Testament. The basic character of Judaism is realism and optimism, which are closely related and the preconditions of actual theism, since they consider the material world absolutely real, and life as a pleasing gift made expressly for us. The basic character of Brahmanism and Buddhism, on the contrary, is idealism and pessimism, since they allow the world only a dreamlike existence, and regard life as the consequence of our sins. In the doctrine of the Zend-Avesta, from which Judaism is known to have derived, the pessimistic element is still present and represented by Ahriman. In Judaism, however, he is accorded only a subordinate position as Satan, who is nonetheless still, like Ahriman, the author of snakes, scorpions, and vermin. Judaism employs him straightway to repair its fundamental error of optimism, namely to produce the fall, which then introduces into that religion the pessimistic element required for the sake of fidelity to the most obvious of truths. This element is the most correct basic idea in the religion, although it transfers to the course of existence what ought to be represented as its ground and as preceding it. The New Testament must be of Indian origin, witness of that it is altogether Indian ethic, in which morality leads to asceticism, its pessimism, and its avatar. But it is for precisely this reason that it stands in decided intrinsic opposition to the Old Testament, so that the only thing in the Old Testament which could provide a connecting link with it was the story of the fall. For when this Indian doctrine entered into the Promised Land, there arose the task of uniting the knowledge of the corruption and misery of the world, of its need for redemption and of salvation through an avatar, together with the morality of self-denial and atonement, with Jewish monotheism and its "Behold, it was very good." And this union was achieved, as far as it could be, as far, that is, as two so completely heterogeneous, indeed antithetical doctrines can be united. The Creator from nothing, separate from the world, is identified with the Savior, and through him with mankind, whose representative he is, since mankind is redeemed in him as it once fell in Adam, and has since lain enmeshed in sin, corruption, suffering, and death. For this is how the world appears here as much as it does in Buddhism, and no longer in the light of the Jewish optimism which had found everything very good. The devil himself is now styled Prince of the World. John 12:31. The world is no longer an end, but a means. The kingdom of joy lies beyond it and beyond death. Renunciation in this world, and the direction of all hope towards a better world, constitutes the spirit of Christianity. The way to such a better world is, however, opened by reconciliation, that is, redemption from the world and its ways. In morality, the lex talionis is replaced by the command to love one's enemy, the promise of a numberless prosperity by the promise of eternal life, and the punishment of transgressions to the fourth generation by the Holy Ghost, beneath whose wings everything reposes. Thus we see the doctrine of the Old Testament rectified and given new meaning by that of the New, whereby it is made intrinsically and essentially to accord with the ancient religions of India. Everything true in Christianity is also to be discovered in Brahmanism and Buddhism, but the Jewish notion of an animated nothingness, a temporal product which can never be too humbly thankful for an ephemeral existence full of misery, fear, and want, nor praise Jehovah too highly for it, this you will look for in vain in Hinduism and Buddhism. If one wanted to venture on conjectures as to how this agreement with Indian doctrines came about, one might suggest that the flight into Egypt may rest on some historical fact, and that Jesus was brought up by Egyptian priests, whose religion was of Indian origin, received Indian ethics and the concept of the avatar from them, and afterwards sought to adapt these doctrines to Jewish dogmas and to graft them onto the ancient tree. The feeling of his own moral and intellectual superiority may then have induced him to regard himself as an avatar, and consequently to call himself the Son of Man, so as to indicate that he was more than simply a man. It is even possible to think that, with the strength and purity of his will, and by virtue of the omnipotence which pertains to will in general, as thing in itself, which we know from the fact of animal magnetism and other magical effects related to it, he was able to perform so-called miracles, i.e., operate through the metaphysical influence of the will, in connection with which the instruction he received from the Egyptian priests would likewise have stood him in good stead. Legend would subsequently have exaggerated the number and miraculousness of these miracles. It is only suppositions of this kind which can to some extent explain how Paul, whose principal epistles at least must be genuine, can seriously represent as God incarnate and as one with the Creator of the world a man who has died so recently that many of his contemporaries are still alive. For seriously meant apotheoses of this sort and magnitude usually require many centuries to come gradually to fruition. On the other hand, this consideration could serve as an argument against the genuineness of the Pauline epistles in general. That the Gospels we possess rest upon an original, or at any rate a fragment from the time of Jesus and from his circle, I conclude from the objectionable prophecy of the end of the world and of the Lord's glorious second coming in the clouds, which is supposed to be going to take place during the lifetime of some of those present when it is promised. For that this promise remained unfulfilled is an extremely vexatious circumstance, which proved a stumbling block not only in later ages, but caused embarrassment already to Peter and Paul. If the Gospels, 100 or so years later, had been indited without the aid of contemporary documents, one would surely have guarded against introducing prophecies of this kind, the non-fulfillment of which had already been brought to light. The principle laid down by Strauss, that the gospel story, or at any rate its individual detail, is to be explained mythologically, is certainly correct, and it will be hard to determine how far this principle extends. As to the nature of myths in general, it will be best to employ less delicate examples closer to hand. Thus, for example, King Arthur was throughout the Middle Ages, in France as well as in England, a quite authentic person, known for many deeds and always appearing with the same character and the same entourage, with his round table, his knights, his heroic acts, his magician, his faithless wife, and her Lancelot du Lac, etc., etc. He constituted the standing theme of poets and romancers of many centuries, who all present us with the same characters, and agree fairly well in the events that they describe, and noticeably differ from one another only in costumes and customs. That is to say, according to which age they belong to. Now, a few years ago, the French government sent M. de la Villemarque to England to investigate the origin of these myths of King Arthur. The facts behind the myths turned out to be that a petty chieftain named Arthur lived in Wales at the beginning of the 6th century. He fought indefatigably against the invading Saxons, but his insignificant deeds have been forgotten. It is he, then, who, heaven knows why, became the splendid personage celebrated for many centuries in countless songs, romances, and stories. The case is almost the same with Roland, who is the hero of the whole Middle Ages, celebrated in countless songs, epic poems, and romances, and even statues, until at last he was transfigured by Ariosto. History, however, refers to him once, and that only incidentally and in 4 words. Eginhard includes him in the list of those who stayed behind at Roncesvalles, as Rudlandus, Britannici limitis praefectus, and that is all we know about him, just as all we really know about Jesus Christ is the passage in Tacitus. Sects. Augustinianism, with its dogma of original sin and what is associated with it, is, has already been said, actual Christianity. Pelagianism, on the other hand, is the attempt to take Christianity back to the crude and shallow Judaism and its optimism. The antithesis between Augustinianism and Pelagianism has continually divided the Church, going down to their ultimate ground, One could say that the former speaks of the essence in itself of things, the latter of phenomena which it takes for essence. The Pelagian, for example, denies original sin, since the child, which has as yet done nothing whatever, must be innocent. He does this because he does not see that, while the child is a beginning as phenomenon, it is not a beginning as thing in itself. The same consideration applies to free will, to the Saviour's propitiatory death, to grace, and, in short, to everything. In consequence of its comprehensibility and shallowness, Pelagianism always predominates, but it does so more than ever now, as rationalism. The Greek Orthodox Church preaches a qualified Pelagianism, as, since the Council of Trent, does the Catholic Church, its object being to set itself in opposition to the Augustinian and consequently mystically minded Luther, and to Calvin. The Jesuits are no less semi-Pelagian. On the other hand, the Jansenists are Augustinian, and their doctrine may well be the most genuine form of Christianity. For, by rejecting celibacy and asceticism in general, together with the saints, who are the representatives of asceticism, Protestantism has become a truncated, or rather decapitated Christianity, whose apex is missing. Rationalism. The fundamental distinction between religions does not lie in whether they are monotheistic, polytheistic, pantheistic, or atheistic, as Buddhism is, but in whether they are optimistic or pessimistic. The Old and the New Testaments are for this reason diametrically opposed, and their union forms a very strange centaur. For the Old Testament is optimistic, the New Testament pessimistic. The former is a tune in the major, the latter is a tune in the minor. The basic character of Christianity, which Augustine, Luther, and Melanchthon perceived very truly and as far as possible systematized, our present-day rationalists seek to expunge and exegesize away, so as to lead Christianity back to a prosaic, egoistic, optimistic Judaism, adding to it an improved morality and the future life which is demanded by a consistent optimism, so that the glorious time we are having shall not come to so early an end, and death, which cries out all too loudly against the optimistic outlook, and comes at last like the stone guest to the feasting Don Juan, shall be done away with. These rationalists are honest but shallow people, with no presentiment of the profound meaning of the New Testament myth, who cannot get beyond the optimism of Judaism. They want the plain, unvarnished truth in the domain of history, as in that of dogma. They can be compared with the ehumerists of antiquity. What the supranaturalists bring us is, to be sure, fundamentally a mythology, but this mythology is the vehicle of important, profound truths which cannot be conveyed to the understanding of the great masses in any other way. The common error of both parties is that they seek in religion the plain, unvarnished, literal truth. But the plain, unvarnished, literal truth is striven for only in philosophy. Religion possesses only a truth suitable to the people, an indirect, a symbolic, allegorical truth. Christianity is an allegory reflecting a true idea, but the allegory itself is not what is true. To take the allegory for the truth is the error which supranaturalists and rationalists agree in making. The former will assert that the allegory is in itself true. The latter will twist and bend its meaning until they have, according to their own light, made it true in itself. Each party is accordingly able to make pertinent and valid points against the other. The rationalists say to the supranaturalists, "Your doctrine isn't true." The latter retort, "Your doctrine isn't Christianity." Both are right. The rationalists believe they are taking reason as their standard. In fact, however, their standard is only reason caught up in the presuppositions of theism and optimism, rather like Rousseau's Profession de foi du vicaire Savoyard, that prototype of all rationalism. Of Christian dogma they will grant validity to nothing but what they hold true sensu proprio, namely theism and the immortality of the soul. While supranaturalism possesses, at any rate, allegorical truth, rationalism cannot be accorded any truth at all. The rationalists are simply wrong. If you would be a rationalist, you will have to be a philosopher, and as such emancipate yourself from all authority, stride forwards and shrink at nothing. If, however, you would be a theologian, you ought to be consistent and cleave to authority, even if it insists on your believing what is incomprehensible. A man cannot serve two masters, so it is either reason or the Scriptures. The juste milieu here means falling between two stools. Either believe or philosophize. Whichever you choose wholeheartedly. But to believe up to a certain point and no further, and to philosophize up to a certain point and no further, this is the half-heartedness which constitutes the fundamental trait of rationalism. Those who think the sciences can go on advancing and spreading wider and wider without threatening the continued existence and prosperity of religion are very much in error. Physics and metaphysics are the natural enemies of religion. To speak of peace and accord between them is very ludicrous. It is bellum ad internectionem. Religions are the children of ignorance, and they do not long survive their mother. Omar understood that when he burned the library at Alexandria. His reason for doing so, that the knowledge contained in the books was also either contained in the Quran or was superfluous, is regarded as absurd, but is in fact very shrewd if taken cum grano salis. It signifies that if the sciences go beyond the Quran, they are enemies of religion, and consequently not to be tolerated. Christianity would be in much better shape today if Christian rulers had been as wise as Omar. By now, however, it's a little late to burn all the books. Mankind is growing out of religion as out of its childhood clothes. Faith and knowledge do not get on well together in the same head. They are like a wolf and a sheep in the same cage, and knowledge is the wolf which threatens to eat up its companion. In its death throes we see religion clinging to a morality whose mother it would like to pretend to be. In vain. Genuine morality is dependent on no religion, although religion sanctions and thereby sustains it. Belief is like love. It cannot be compelled. And as any attempt to compel love produces hate, so is the attempt to compel belief, which first produces real unbelief. The reason that civilization is at its highest point among Christian people is not that Christianity is favorable to it, but that Christianity is dead, and no longer exercises much influence. As long as it did exercise influence, civilization was at a very low point among Christian people. All religion is antagonistic towards culture. What a bad conscience religion must have is to be judged by the fact that it is forbidden, under pain of severe punishment, to mock it.